was very productive. And he began reasoning to himself, saying, what shall I do since I have no place to store my crops? And he said, this is what I will do. I will tear down my barns. I will build larger ones. I will store all of my grain and my goods. Notice how many times he said the word I and my in that passage. I and my. And I will say to my soul, in verse 19, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said to him, you fool. Now, we're not to call one another fools, but this is Jesus speaking, okay? He has a right to. He made us, okay? This is Jesus judging this man. You fool. This very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God. You know, there are two temptations when we read this passage of Scripture. The first temptation is to say, why, this really doesn't apply to me. It only applies to rich people. Well, did you know, I did a little research this last week on the computer, and compared to 90% of the population of this world, almost every American would be considered wealthy. Did you know that there are 925 million people, 13.1% of the world's population, or 1 out of every 7 people, that go to bed at night undernourished, underfed? So the first temptation is to say, well, that's just about rich people. It's not about me. We better be careful. Take it in context. Number 2, the second temptation is that people oftentimes think perhaps they have a problem with greed, but not me. Perhaps he has a problem with greed, but not me. And Jesus warns us in this passage of Scripture to watch out. That greed, in fact, is very subtle. So today I want us to think for a few minutes about how to recognize greed, and then secondly, how to avoid it. First and foremost, how to recognize greed. What is greed? Well, I looked in the dictionary to make sure we got it right, that I got it right. Merriam-Webster says that greed is a selfish or excessive desire for more of something than is needed. You know, it can be, as one person said, an insatiable appetite for more stuff, more things. Greed is not being content with what you got, with what you have. Now, where does it come from? What's the source of greed? Number 1, it's a false belief that a person's life consists of what he possesses. Look in the Scripture at verse 15 again. And Jesus said, beware to be on your guard against every form of greed, for not even when one has an abundance does life consist of his possessions. Not even when one is rich, is what Jesus is saying. Not even to rich people does life consist of possessions. Number 2, I think greed comes from Satan. I think it's a ploy or a trick of the devil to get you and I to work longer hours and work harder and do everything that we possibly can to get more stuff, whether it's money or whether it's things. What that usually ends up is that we're worn out. I mean, any person only has so much energy and effort and hours to give to work in order to accumulate things. Thirdly, where does greed come from? I think it's a false belief that more stuff brings happiness. Look at verse 19 in our text today. And I will say, this is what the rich man said. He was talking to himself. I will say, so you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry. Stuff is not what life is all about, and stuff does not bring happiness. Years ago, I worked for Merrill Lynch as a stockbroker in Jackson, Mississippi. That was an interesting job. I got to talk to some of the wealthiest people in the state of Mississippi. And one thing that I discovered during those years is the fact that the amount in a person's bank account or in their stock account did not determine their happiness. Happiness does not come from more stuff. Jesus pointed that out. The rich man didn't know that. He had played fool to understanding the way of the world in that time, which is no different than the way of the world today, that the more stuff you got, the happier you're going to be. That's a lie. A lie straight from the devil. But if he can get us to play that lie, then we place way, way too much value in things, in bank accounts, in stock accounts. Then how do I know? How do I know if I'm greedy? I don't want to be like that rich man, you say. I don't want to be like him. How do I know if I'm greedy? Number one, here are 8 characteristics, I believe, of a greedy person. They secretly covet what other people have and even despise them for having it. The spite toward a person because they're wealthy. And we say, I work just as hard as they do. I work just as hard as they do. And look how little I have, but look how much they have. There was a Bible, an illustration of that in the Old Testament, and I looked it up. It was most interesting. It's the story that you probably know from the 21st chapter of Kings. The story about Naboth's vineyard. Remember that story? 1 Kings chapter 21. I want to read you only a short portion of that. And now it came about after these things that Naboth, the Jezreelite, had a vineyard. And it was in Jezreel beside the palace of King Ahab of Samaria. And Ahab spoke to Naboth, saying, give me your vineyard, and I will have it for a vegetable garden, because it's close to and beside my palace. And I will give you a better vineyard. Or, if you like, I will give you the price of it, the vineyard, in money. But Naboth said to Ahab, the Lord forbid me that I should give you the inheritance of my fathers. Inheritance back in that day and time meant a lot more than it does today. What Naboth was saying is this has come down through the lines of heredity. It belonged to maybe my great-grandfather, my grandfather, my father, and was been passed down to me. God forbid that I should sell it to you. So Ahab, in verse 4, came into the house, that means his castle, the house of Ahab, and he was sullen and vexed because of the word which Naboth the Jezreelite had spoken to him. In other words, he was having a pity party. And he said, I will not give you the inheritance of my fathers. And he laid down on his bed and turned his face to the wall, and he ate no food. Having a pity party, feeling sorry for himself. The king thought he could have everything because he was king, thought he deserved everything. He coveted what his neighbor had. which was a good plot of land, not necessarily a large plot, but a good plot that produced good grapes in season, a vineyard. Second way that we can recognize if we have greed in our life is to gloat about what we have or to gawk or gaze at it all the time. I remember when I got my first new car. I was so proud of that thing. I mean, I wouldn't dare taking it to the Walmart parking lot because it didn't even exist in that time. I would sit there and I would look at that thing and I would wax it. Back in those days, you actually wax cars, you know. Some people quit doing that today. They pull in the car wash and spend an extra 50 cents and the car wash is supposed to wax your car for you, right? That's the way it works today. But I would wax it. I would polish it. I didn't want any dirt to get on that car. I was so proud of that car. Gloating over things that we have that have been given us by God is a good sign of greed in our lives. Placing too much value on something. Another indication of greed in our lives can be worry. Excessive worry about what we have and how we're going to protect it. Being nervous and anxious or obsessive over things that we have. Now, I insure my car. State tells me to. They require that I do that. I also insure my house. I think that's pretty wise to do that because in the neighborhood where we live, I mean, you can have a fire at any time. That can happen in western Colorado, right? But you know what? I've never lost sleep at night over whether somebody was going to steal that car or burn down my house. Excessive worry is what we're talking about. Going to the extreme to try to protect things. I mean, I've seen these movies sometimes from New York City. And now I realize it might be kind of dangerous to live in certain places in New York City. But I've seen doors that literally had safety locks from the top to the bottom of those things. From top to bottom, all the way down. That's a little bit excessive. I mean, if I was that afraid to live in New York, I think I'd live somewhere else. You have a choice about where to live. Excessive